It was at Rowdy's, a country place about a mile outside of town. She was sitting with two other girls, and as soon as I laid eyes on her, I knew I just had to try it, or I would regret it forever. The band was without a net, and they were playing a two-piece. I walked over to their table and asked her to dance. She smiled, said she'd love to, got up and walked out onto the floor. She felt good in my arms. We were suited for each other. It was like we were made for each other. I learned her name was Amanda, but she preferred to be called Mandy. The double ended, and the guitarist said, "Everyone hit the dance floor for Electric Slide." Slide was followed by Tush Push, and we stayed in the audience for both songs. The band then took a break, and I escorted her back to her table and her friends, and she invited me to join them. I was introduced to Pam and Shelley, and they recognized me as Augustus Weaver, but I preferred Augie to Augustus. Mandy asked, "What brought Augie Weaver to the Rowdy on this beautiful summer evening?" "I just felt like dancing tonight." "You wanted to dance, but you didn't bring your girlfriend?" "I don't have one, but I don't need one to dance." "Why don't you have a girlfriend? Is there something wrong with you?" "Not that I know of. It's just that I travel a lot and I'm never here long enough to get into a relationship." "What do you do that makes you travel so much?" "I'm in arms sales and I'm constantly traveling somewhere to make sales or educate people on our products." That was an outright lie. Actually, I was Sergeant Augie Weaver, serving in the Army and had a 3-day vacation, but I had experienced firsthand that the local ladies didn't really care for soldiers. Probably because when they were interested in a guy, he was transferred to another unit and they were left behind. Before they started digging further, I asked them what they were doing, and Mandy told me that they were nurses at the local hospital who wanted to relieve the stress of working with the sick and suffering, and have a little fun. No sooner had the conversation gone any further than the group returned. Shelley said, "My turn," and we went to the floor. After that, I had to give Pam her turn. When I got Mandy out on the floor again, she asked, "Am I losing you to these sluts?" "Hardly. When I walked through the door and saw you, I somehow knew immediately that you were the one I was supposed to be with. When I approached the table to ask you to dance, I was scared to death you'd say no." "Your fears were unfounded. As soon as I saw you, I had the same feelings. Let me get my purse, and let's get out of here." Once outside, she said, "There's a motel across the street. It's not easy for me at all, but I feel like I should lock you in there right now." I felt the same way, so I took her hand, walked across the street, and got a room. In the room, we undressed, then sat on the bed and started making out like horny teenagers. I made love to her body. I kissed her, and then she said, "Make love to me, Augie." And I did. It was the first of several, and we fell asleep, exhausted and pressed against each other. When we woke up, we carried on again, and then went to a nearby diner called Mama's. No kidding, it really was called Mom's. While we ate, Mandy asked me what I wanted to do that day, and when I answered, "Find someone to marry us," and she laughed. "I'm ready, but it can't be that quick. I have to let my mom know, and she'll want to plan the wedding. You think of something we can do while you drive me home. I have to let my roommates know I'm okay." "Roommates?" "Shelley and Pam. Shelley drove last night, so you have to drive me home." I drove her home, and my life went to hell when we walked into her apartment. Shelley and Pam were in uniform, with gold second lieutenant's bars on their collars. Like I said, it was a surprise, and not a good one. I looked at Mandy and said, "I assumed that when you said you were nurses at the local hospital, you meant the county hospital. For our service, the duty hospital is the local hospital. Give me a minute to change my clothes, and then we can go." She left the room, and as soon as she left, I turned to Shelley and Pam and told them, "Tell her I'm sorry, and that I will never forget her." I turned and walked away. Why? Because Mandy was an officer and I was a soldier, and the Army would never allow us to have a relationship. It hurt, really hurt, but not as much as it would have hurt if we'd gotten in deeper before we found out. It killed me to want to leave. She was the only one. I knew it as soon as I saw her. But there was no hope for us. If I had served a short time and was close to being discharged, we would have made it. But I had only served a year after my second enlistment, and I had almost 5 more to go. I had a 3-day leave and didn't have to come back until the next day, but I had lost interest in anything, so I came back early, which surprised a lot of people because no one had ever done that. For the next 2 months, I cried silently every night thinking about Mandy and what could have been. Then something happened that I hoped would never happen. At the firing range, a private was being stupid with his weapon. For some reason, he turned away from the target and his rifle was pointed in my direction. When one of the other sergeants saw this, slapped him on the shoulder and told him to keep his weapon pointed down. The slap startled the guy, and he reflexively pulled the trigger. The bullet went through the fleshy part, my left calf. It didn't hit bone, but it bled like a bucket. I was rushed to the hospital, and the first person who came to see me was Shelley. She gave me a nasty look and said, "I should let you bleed to death for what you did to Mandy, but asshole or not, it's my duty to help." I just looked at her. "What's the matter, asshole? Nothing to say?" "No, ma'am. Nothing to say, ma'am." "Well, I'm not going to tell her you're here because I don't want her to be blamed for what she might do to you. But you better pray that somehow she didn't find out." But of course she did find out, and it wasn't as bad as Shelley thought it would be. Mandy just stared at me for about 15 seconds without saying a word, and then she said, "How could you? Didn't you think it killed me too? I still cry at night thinking about you. You'll never know how much you hurt me, Augie. The man who owned my heart from the moment we met walked away from me without a word, leaving me to think that I was just a one-night stand to him. I'm more sorry than you can imagine, but I'm a realist. As soon as we walked into your apartment that night and caught your neighbors in uniform, I knew we were done for. You know as well as I do that the Army will never tolerate an officer dating a private, let alone being married to one. We could have found a way. No, we couldn't. As soon as the Army found out, and you know they would, one of us would be transferred as far away from the other as possible. If I was nearing the end of my tour of duty, we could try it, but I'm still almost 5 years away from the end of my term." Before she could say anything, the doctor, a captain, came in and asked, "How's the patient, Lieutenant?" "I haven't looked at his chart yet, sir. I was discussing a personal matter with the sergeant." He threw her a strange look, looked at my chart, then removed the bandage and looked at my leg. "It looks like you won't be marching for a while, Sergeant, but you should be able to return to limited duty in a day or so." He turned to Mandy, told her to bandage the wound, and then wanted to see her in his office. "Yes, sir." She silently applied the bandage, and when she had finished, looked at me with a long look, then said, "We'll talk about it later," and left the room. But we didn't talk about it later. At least not at the hospital. 45 minutes after leaving, the doctor came back and started right away. "This place isn't that big, so there's no privacy. I overheard 2 nurses talking about the private that Lieutenant Mandrake was hanging on to, and when I came into the room and she said she was on a private case, I assumed you were the private. When she came into my office, she confirmed it. I ordered her to stay away from you while you were here. From what I hear, you've been estranged from her since you found out she was an officer. Is that true?" "Yes, sir." "It's been my experience that in matters of the heart, what's right and what's wrong is often ignored or overlooked. Lieutenant Mandrake is one of my finest, and I can't afford to lose her. I'll talk to your commanding officer about it, so don't be surprised if you are suddenly transferred somewhere far away from here." "I'm sorry about that, Sergeant. I really am." I was released a day later, and when I reported to my unit, I was reassigned to light duty. 2 days later, I was told to report to my company commander. When I reached his office, the first sergeant told me to go right in. I entered, stopped 6 paces from the desk, saluted and said, "Sergeant Weaver has arrived as ordered, sir." He saluted and said, "Steady, Sergeant. I assume you know why you're here?" "Roughly, sir." "When Captain Byers called me and told me I had to send you out of position and why, I told him I couldn't do it because I couldn't afford to lose an officer of your caliber. He was not happy to hear that, so the good doctor went higher, and I got orders from the battalion to transfer you. How's your Japanese?" "Sir?" "You're being assigned to the 187th Japan." "How much time do I have, sir?" "I'm afraid not. Sergeant Meadows will give you your orders when you leave this office. I've granted you a 10-day travel extension, but you must leave the location today. Any questions?" "No, sir." "Good luck, Sergeant." "Thank you, sir." Dismissed. I came to my senses, saluted, made a grimace, and walked out of the office. The first sergeant handed me my orders and said, "Sorry to see you go, Augie." "It's a shame to leave, Tom. It's not my choice. I was only kicked out of here because I met the woman who was meant for me. I left the location by 6 o'clock and I was pissed. What the hell right did the Army have to punish me for falling in love?" And I didn't kid myself that it wasn't a punishment. When I arrived at my next unit, I had no doubt that my new commanding officer would be thinking, "What kind of freak is this Weaver getting kicked out of his unit and sent to me? I'll have to be on my guard." By the time I got my car back from where I had to park it, I decided to say, "Screw you, Army." I called the number I had for Mandy, and Pam answered. "It's Augie, Pam. Is Mandy busy?" In a couple seconds. "Augie?" "Yeah, babe. I just got my transfer orders to Japan. Dr. Byers wants me as far away from you as possible. My orders give me a 10-day travel delay, and I'd like to spend that time with you if possible." "Are you sure? I don't want to cause you any trouble." "Right. I'll take all the trouble they want to give me if I can spend time with you." "Rowdy's in half an hour?" "I'll see you there." I drove to the Bit-A-V Motel because they had weekly rates, got a room, and then put on my civilian clothes. I was waiting for Mandy when she arrived at the Rowdy, and she threw herself into my arms. We had a drink, and then drove to the motel. We made love and talked and talked and made love and made love and made love and talked for 8 days, and then I got on a bus headed for Fort Lewis, Washington. On the bus, I thought about our conversations. We were both realists. She couldn't resign her commission for another 2 years, and I could only get out of my term of service, which was just under 5 years away, by doing something that would result in a discharge to the reserve on less honorable terms, and I wouldn't do that. In the end, we decided that we would endure and get together at every opportunity. As an enlisted soldier, the Army didn't care what I wanted. But as an officer, Mandy could request assignments and sometimes even get them. We decided that as soon as I knew where I would be serving, I would let her know and she would try to get an assignment, somewhere close to me. We had a tough road ahead of us and we knew it, but under the circumstances, it was all we had. When I arrived at Fort Lewis, I was told that it would be 17 days before the next ship sailed for Japan. Since I was temporary rather than permanent personnel, I managed to get a pass almost every night, and I informed Mandy of this. She arranged to take a vacation and spent 10 of those 17 days with me. 2 days after she left, I found myself on the USNS Marine Lynx, which was bound for Japan. The ship docked in Sasebo, and from there I was transported to the U.S. Army Base Camp Chickamauga in Beppo, Japan, where I was assigned to the 187th Airborne Infantry Regiment, part of the U.S. Occupation Force. After settling in, I wrote Mandy, told her where I was, and, fingers crossed, prayed that she would secure a transfer to the U.S. Army Hospital in Tokyo. My fears about the consequences of punishment proved unfounded. I was received as any other soldier being transferred to another duty station would have been. A week later, I got a letter from Mandy. She had had no luck with her transfer to Japan. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea and Harry Truman decided to intervene. The Army landed in Busan and began to move north. The 187th Regiment, which was part of the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team, was put on alert, and we were waiting to be sent to Korea. Then God decided he needed to mess with us one more time. I received a letter from Mandy telling me that she had finally secured a transfer to the 8167th Army Hospital in Tokyo, and we would soon be together again. The next day, we were transferred to Kimpo Airfield in Korea. A month later, we made a successful parachute landing near the cities of Sukchon and Suncheon to try to capture members of the North Korean government who had fled Pyongyang and to free American POWs who were being moved to the Manchurian border. None of these objectives were accomplished, but it ended with battles at Suwon, Wonju, and Inye. We were then withdrawn from the front line and sent to the rear for resupply and rearmament. I received a letter from Mandy informing me that she was in Japan, and I considered seeing if I could get injured badly enough in the next battle to be sent to a hospital in Japan. But fortunately, I pulled my head out of my ass before doing such a foolish thing. On Good Friday, March 23rd, The 437th Transportation Wing, flying C-119S, dropped us off at Munsanni. We were dropped off to establish blocking positions to cut off the Chinese and North Koreans who were retreating after fighting for the Pusan perimeter. We occupied the terrain necessary to establish blocking positions and immediately engaged in combat. As the enemy retreated toward Uijeongbu, they attacked us fanatically, supported by accurate artillery fire. One such attack was so fierce that we were forced to retreat and establish another defensive position. I noticed that Privates Brown and Smith were not with us. I looked over and saw them on the ground, obviously wounded, about 50 yards from our position. I yelled to the guys to cover me with fire and ran toward them. Smith was evidently the worst off, so I picked him up on my shoulder, carried him to our position, and then went back for Brown. I picked him up, and just as I got back to our position, something knocked my legs out from under me, and everything went black. When I came to, I was in an ambulance with 3 wounded men and was on my way to what I later learned was the 8067th MASH, Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. There, I was stripped and injected with something that knocked me out. I later learned that I had been unconscious for a little over 5 hours. When I came out of that state from the pain, I looked over and saw a nurse standing with her back to me and wheezed, "Water." She turned around and I thought I was either dead and in heaven or still asleep and dreaming because the nurse was Mandy. She rushed over to me and hugged and kissed me and then handed me a glass of water with a straw. I noticed she had a serious look on her face, not a happy one, and I wheezed, "What's wrong?" "Nothing good, Augie. We had to amputate your left leg." I pulled myself up and looked down, but I couldn't see anything because my lower half was covered by the sheet. When I lifted my head, I saw that I was in a large tent full of beds with wounded men lying on them and doctors and nurses walking around tending to them. It surprised me that Mandy hugged and kissed me in front of them. I fell back onto the bunk as a wave of pain came over me. Mandy knew the expression that appeared on my face. She hurried away and came back with a hypodermic syringe and gave me an injection, and I passed out. When I regained consciousness, I asked for water again, and the orderly who gave it to me shouted, "He's awake, ma'am?" Mandy came over and asked me how I was feeling. "Pain in my left leg and my left foot itches like crazy." "You don't have a left foot, Augie. I already told you that. What you're feeling is called phantom limb pain. It's going to take you a while to get over it. The bad news, at least for me, is that you are being evacuated to a hospital in Japan." She saw the question on my face and said, "It's bad news because I'm finally with you and they're going to take you away from me. It's just not fair. Look on the bright side. The love of my life. The Army doesn't need an infantryman with one leg, so I'm going to get a medical exemption. Soon I'll be a civilian and nothing will keep us apart. Unless, of course, you can be happy with a man with only one leg." She grabbed me, hugged me, kissed me, and cried on my shoulder. When she pulled away, she said, "These are tears of happiness, you big fool. I hope you realize that what you just said was a suggestion, and my answer is yes. Hell yes. It didn't happen right away. I was flown to Japan and from there to Walter Reed. I was fitted with an artificial foot and underwent physical therapy and was discharged. I returned home to Detroit, got a job at the Ford Rouge plant, and waited for Mandy to join me. She had finished her tour of duty in Korea and retired. I was waiting for her when she came down the moving ramp from a Douglas DC-3 airplane. She rushed to me and hugged me as if her life depended on it. Cradling me against her, she sobbed on my shoulder as she whispered, "I never thought this could happen. I never believed it would happen. Thank you, Lord. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you." Did we get married and live happily ever after? Oh, of course we did.